Okay, we are now in the world of the seed plants. Really important. Let's do a review question here. So, what kind of plants are these? Pause it. Okay, so here, there's no question. Let's go through it. This one here, this one here that's a moss. This one here, that's a horsetail. This one here, that's a liverwort. You can tell from the liver-shaped kind of body, the thallus. What about this one? You got it, that's a fern, and that one leaves this one here, the club moss. So far all of the plants we've covered are reproducing with spores. With few exceptions, today on Earth today, they're all relatively small plants, still reliant on moisture. Now things are going to get different with the seed plants. So the technical name for the seed plants are the spermatophytes, or the seed plants, literally. This group here, finally, this clade is monophyletic. It's all of the plants on Earth with seeds, and they include all of the descendants of that first seed plant. Today there's two major clades, the gymnosperms, which reproduce with cones. The cones produce the pollen, produce the seeds, and the angiosperms, also called the flowering plants, where the flowers are going to produce the seeds and the pollen. And since they show up, well, to be honest, they're showing up in those coal forests as kind of probably weedy plants, but they really take over around 250 million years ago during what's called the Mesozoic. If dinosaurs are around, seed plants are around. If the dinosaurs go extinct, the seed plants stay around. In general, we're going to see gymnosperms during the age of dinosaurs and flowering plants after the dinosaurs. It's not quite that simple, but that's good enough. The synapomorphies, you know them. We got seeds, we got pollen, the specialized gametophytes. We have specialized spores, the microspores, the megaspores. We have special sporangia, microsporangia, megasporangia. Collectively, all of this is called heterospory. We focus on the seeds because they're the visible big things, but all of this is really important. Fundamentally different kind of reproduction, much more potentially efficient in terms of reproduction if you're using an animal for pollination, but overall very, very different when it comes to reproduction. So phylogenetically, we are right in here. If I were you, I'd add cones and flowers and fruit for the angiosperms. Okay, monophyletic. We're going to cover a few of the gymnosperm groups today, and then we'll do the angiosperms next class. And with that, we'll probably end the plants on Thursday's class. So let's do the gymnosperms. Division, gymnospermy. Quick sidebar. Etymology of these. Okay, so we know sperm means seed. What does gymno, or if you're of British persuasion, it's gymno, and angio mean? Well, we know angio from way back when, I forget where, but we mentioned it, means to surround or cover. And so angiosperm means the seed is covered. It is surrounded technically by the carpel, the female reproductive organs. Gymno or gymno is the opposite of covered. It means naked or exposed. And that's because the cone here, when it opens, the seeds just fall out. They are not wrapped fully by a fruit as they are in angiosperm. So next time you go to the gymnasium or the gymnasium, you can think that's the place of nakedness. Not literally naked, but compared to what you're probably wearing now, more naked because you're going to be sweating. And so in ancient Greek times, you'd be wearing a loincloth instead of a toga, whether you're male or female. So not literally naked, but much more exposed. Okay, so the gymnosperms or the gymnosperms, these naked seeded plants using cones, there's only about 800 species alive on Earth today. They have a really great fossil record, many more extinct species, but as plants go on Earth, this is by far the least diversity we've seen. 12,000 of ferns, 12,000 of mosses. There's less than 1,000 of these, so an order of magnitude or more or less. Most common during the age of dinosaurs, but clearly still around today. There's going to be a few exceptions, but in general, the gymnosperms are evergreen, meaning that they keep their leaves year round, and their leaves are typically reduced into more like pine needle sizes or kind of almost like grass-like blades of leaves. In either case, reduced surface area means less feeding, but also less water loss. Very successful group of plants everywhere from the equator and the tropics to the desert. There are some desert groups as well. Cactuses are more spectacularly adapted to dryness than these are, but these are pretty amazing. And then even up to the North Pole are pretty close, as far as a plant can survive. This group's here. So these are pretty extreme plants collectively, and I know of no exceptions. They're all wind pollinated. Actually, there are a few tropical exceptions, but generally wind pollinate, produce enormous amounts of pollen, tends to be yellow, tends to be enormous. Almost no one's allergic to them because the pollen's too big for your cells really to interact with. Synapomorphy of the gymnosperms are going to be cones. Which again is where the sporangia are that make the spores that ultimately make the pollen and the seeds. And in a general sense, we'll say if it's a fleshy cone, that's the male cone that makes the pollen. I'll give you an example in a slide or two. And then the female cones are what make the woodier seeds. So if it's a woody pine cone, that's the female cone. The male cone almost looks like a group of leaves, but they're not. And when the seed is fertilized, then the cone, just like a flower becomes a fruit, the cone opens up, it's mature, and releases the seeds that also tend to be wind dispersed. Life cycle here, you've seen this so many times that this is easy. We've got our sporophyte with our separate cones. The male cone does meiosis to make the spore that becomes the pollen that blows away in the wind, finds its way into a female cone, where hopefully the spores are produced by the female cone. The spore is here. The spore is going to make the egg by mitosis. At this point, this pollen hopefully has found its way in. The pollen makes the seed, makes the sperm. The sperm swims inside the seed into the egg and fertilizes it. We now have baby zygote, grows into the baby embryo, still retained in mom gametophyte. Here's baby embryo sporophyte in the seed gametophyte. All of this is within the pine cone. The pine cone opens up because it's mature. The baby's been fertilized, and then the seeds are released, usually dispersed by the wind, and then they can be dispersed by animals if they get eaten, but they travel, find a moist patch of soil or a not so moist patch of soil, and the cycle starts over. Okay, so that's the gymnosperms in a general sense. We're going to go through three groups of really awesome gymnosperms. The first, the cycads. Only about 150 species. Many of these are endangered. This is a group of plants that is kind of critically endangered on Earth today. They tend to live only in tropical environments with sandy soils, so the soil is not very high quality, and kind of like the tree ferns, they look like palm trees, but they have a much woodier trunk. The cone is on top producing the pollen and the seeds, and then the fronds of kind of almost fern-like leaves come off the top. Evolutionarily, I am sure there has to be a close relationship between these and the tree ferns. One of the things that's really cool is that tropical soil has terrible fertilizer. There's so much competition for resources that it gets recycled very, very quickly. And so as a way to enhance fertilization in a world that's very competitive, the roots of these have little nodules that are filled with cyanobacteria. And we normally think of cyanobacteria as doing photosynthesis, but these ones live underground and they're doing nitrogen fixation. And this is what's called a symbiosis, where the bacteria are protected and get some free kind of resources they need, like water, to do what they need. And then in exchange, the plant is getting some fertilizer. So let's see some cycads. So here we have a male cycad, and typically gymnosperm plants are male or female, or I should be less gender kind of specific, sperm producing and egg or seed producing. And so this is a cone that produces pollen. It tends to be softer and it's described as fleshy. Tends to form on the top. It produces pollen, and then at the end of the season it dries up and then eventually falls off, like this one's doing here. This is a more woody pine cone. So this is the one that produces the eggs and the seed. Sometimes they're red. Usually they're not this bright colored, but again, they're formed on top. It looks like a gigantic pine cone. And these can be a foot tall, really gigantic. You can imagine dinosaurs were eating the fruits of things like these, although it's not a fruit. It's like a cone. There's a lot of nutrition within there. And these leaves are pretty woody, probably not very edible, unlike a fern leaf, but still there probably were some dinosaurs eating plants like this. If you dig these plants up and look at their roots, these little brown, what look like puffballs, are actually little root nodules where you've got colonies of cyanobacteria that are helping fertilize the plant. So it's not only increasing surface area for drinking of water, but it's also getting more fertilizer that way. The other group are the ginkgos, and this group here has a huge fossil record, but today there's only one species. You might assume with one species it's close to extinction, but this species is so loved by humans that we plant it all over the place, and so it's definitely not going to go extinct. The species is Ginkgo biloba. Be aware that different spellings put a G or a K in different positions. You could pronounce it Jinko, or ginkgo, or ginkgo. There's different kind of historical pronunciations for this. This is the correct current spelling, but again, the name is derived from a Chinese term, and so transliteration sometimes historically has been a little bit different. The name ginkgo biloba has to do with these very weird leaves. These are almost like angiosperm leaves that have two lobes. They're bilaterally symmetrical and very much like an angiosperm, like an oak tree, which is an angiosperm. They don't produce flowers, but they have a lot of flowering plant-like characteristics. One, they have leaves that instead of being evergreen are deciduous. So when it gets cold and drier, the leaves change color, just like they do up here in the fall, and then they eventually drop off and regrow. That's a very more angiosperm trait. In fact, it's one of the only angiosperms that does this. Also, the fruit, the cones start off looking like a male cone, just like a normal gymnosperm, but the female cone, instead of being woody, forms what looks like a fruit, almost like a plum, that has a meaty surface on the outside that animals love to eat. In fact, humans like to eat it as well. And there's a seed inside. And so this is like a convergent fruit. Now, it wasn't a flower, so I'm going to say it's fruit-like. But again, you can see that a lot of groups of life are experimenting with these adaptations because they're good solutions for things. In this case, dispersal and outcrossing. So here's ginkgos. This is the distinctive leaves. They're really beautiful. They change color and they carpet areas. They're really gorgeous. And then these are the male cones that produce the pollen. Just like the male cones here, they're fleshier and then they eventually fall off. And then the female cones aren't woody in this case, but are kind of more of a berry-like or fruit-like thing. I'll tell you a cool little fact is that because the plants are either male or female, you can basically walk through the woods, and if you see these plants, you can tell if you are near male or female, because if it's female, they produce tons of these fruits. They drop and cover the ground, and they're very noticeable, but what's most noticeable is once they're ripe, they smell like vomit. And so if you're near a female ginkgo tree in the fall, when the fruit is produced, the area will smell like really kind of a fraternity after the weekend. There's just a vomit smell everywhere. It's terrible. It's been said that when China sets up an embassy in a different country to stake that the embassy land is part of China, they plant ginkgo trees. These species are native to the woods of kind of northern China. And it's been told that if they like the host country, they'll plant a male tree. If they don't like the country, they'll plant a female tree so that the neighbors kind of get stunk out a little bit. Anyway, some cultures, like China, will pickle these and eat them. It's a bit of an acquired taste, but before they're ripe, they're not super, super nasty funky. So we'll leave that there. We'll finish the last group of gymnosperms in our last module for today.